In the first half of September, Ukraine launched a surprising and devastating counter-offensive in Kharkiv Oblast, collapsing the Russian front on this axis. The Russian units hastily retreated to the eastern bank of the river Oskil and braced for another Ukrainian offensive. In this video, we're going to describe the continuation of the Ukrainian attack on this axis with a focus on Liman, along with discussing other important events of Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in the second half of September, including the Russian mobilization and the situation on other fronts. This video is sponsored by Masterworks. Bloomberg is now predicting a 100% chance of a recession in the US, which will have shockwaves around the world. So understandably, people are scrambling to preserve their wealth somewhere outside of inflation's reach. For our parents' generation, that meant investing in gold or real estate. But historic mortgage rates are driving the real estate market off a cliff, and gold is only a stopgap, with near zero growth during normal conditions. But there's a third option, an asset that thrives during times like these and when the economy is booming. Low correlation to stocks, inflation hedging qualities, and exceptional resilience: contemporary art. Morgan Stanley says that art often experiences less price volatility than stocks. Data shows it's outpaced the S&P 500 for the last 26 years, and the last time inflation was this high, it was one of the only 3 things to gain value. Not just by a little either, but an average of over 17% per year. That's why Masterworks is flooded with demand as people are looking to diversify. They've become the biggest buyer in the art market, offering shares in contemporary art by the greats, from Banksy to Picasso. Masterworks demonstrates art's strength in a crisis, because even as the stock market has fallen over 20% this year, Masterworks sold a painting for a 21.5% return just a few weeks ago. So it's no surprise that demand for Masterworks is so high that there's a waitlist, but you can skip it by clicking the link in the description. After withdrawing to the eastern bank of the river Oskil, the Russian command intended to create a new front along this river. But after consolidating its gains made in the first half of September, Ukraine continued pushing forward. Their new objective was presumably the defeat of the considerable Russian contingent in Liman and liberating Svatove, another important supply line of the Russian army in North Donbass on the intersection of highways P07 and P66. On September 16th, the 92nd Mechanized Brigade and Kraken Regiment crossed Oskil to liberate the rest of Kupiansk on the eastern bank of the river. From there they moved towards Borova, which has a road leading east to Svatove. Also on September 16th, Ukraine launched a pincer movement towards Liman, which would become the main focus of fighting on this axis. On this day, the 95th Air Assault Brigade and elements of the Ukrainian National Guard liberated Dibrova in the south of Liman. On September 17th, the 79th Air Assault Brigade liberated Shirova, 6 kilometers west of Liman, while the 71st Separate Jaeger Brigade and the 81st Airmobile Brigade took control of Studinok and Sosnova to the northwest of Liman. On September 18th, the Ukrainian advance continued with the liberation of the towns of Oskil and Yatskivka. Even more noteworthy was the liberation of Bilohorivka, as the Ukrainian units managed to force the Seversky Donets River in this section. This is the same Bilohorivka where the Russian army lost at least 1 BTG earlier in May trying to cross the river. Liberation of Bilohorivka meant that the Russians do not have full control of Luhansk Oblast anymore, and it may become an important bridgehead for the Ukrainian army for its future operations to liberate Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. On September 18th, it was reported that the Ukrainian 81st Air Assault Brigade regained control of Rubtsy and Krimki, while the 71st Brigade liberated Yarova. Ukraine's pincer movement was closing down on Liman and making the situation for elements of the Russian 20th Combined Arms Army, namely the remnants of the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 144th Guards Motor Rifle Division, 13th and 16th Bars Volunteer Reserve units of the Russian Army, and other units stationed in Liman and its surroundings, increasingly difficult. Attacks on Liman from several directions were reported by the Russian propagandist Wargonzo Telegram channel. The situation of the Bars 13 unit, which was stationed in Drobysheva, was particularly precarious, as reports of its encirclement circulated on these days. On September 23rd, Ukraine's 25th Airborne Brigade liberated Korovy Yar. Next was Novoselivka, which was regained by elements of the same unit, along with units of the Ukrainian National Guard. It is reported that, unlike the collapse and hasty withdrawal of the Russian units in the first half of September, this time the orders from the command for the Russian units in and around Liman was to stand their ground and fight. But evidently this did not change much, as the southern portion of the Russian front was crumbling amidst intense pressure from the Ukrainian army. By September 27th, the situation of the Russian units in this section became even more desperate. Along the northern arm of the Ukrainian pincer, the 25th Air Assault Brigade liberated Kapivka, Rydkadab, Nova and Zelena Dolina and advanced on Kolodyezhy. This effectively meant that one of the two supply lines to Liman was cut by the Ukrainian army from the north. Simultaneously, the southern arm of the Ukrainian pincer, led by the 95th Air Assault Brigade, achieved some progress towards Toska and Kreminna. Taking the second supply line on the Zaporozhye-Toska section under control would have meant operational encirclement of the Russian units in the area. It was reported that Russia could have had anywhere from 2,000 to 8,000 troops in Liman, fighting against 6,000 to 20,000 Ukrainians. As they did not intend to retreat, the eventual surrender or destruction of the whole contingent of the Russian army in this section would become the most realistic outcome. Along with that, Ukraine continued expanding its bridgehead around the eastern portion of Kupiansk. By September 28th, the 92nd Mechanized Brigade liberated Kupiansk-Vezlovye, Kuchurivka, Petropavlivka and Kivsharivka and moved south towards Borova, while another Ukrainian group moved north towards Borova, while liberating Lazova, Piskyradkivsky and probably Malivka and Vyshche-Solone. These two groups presumably aimed to join around Borova and move east towards Svatova, which, as we mentioned, is on an important highway intersection. The Ukrainian advance in this area was checked by the Russian 18th, 76th and 144th Divisions, which attempted to counterattack and managed to hold the Ukrainians on a defensive line, stretching from Pytliman to Kovalivka and from Kovalivka to Nevska. On September 28th, the situation for the Russian units in Liman and Drobysheva continued to deteriorate, as Liman and Drobysheva remained under intense Ukrainian pressure. Ukrainian units did not attempt frontal assaults on Liman, and instead continued their pincer movement around it, while weakening the Russian defences and their resolve in the area through artillery fire. Elsewhere on this front, the Ukrainian forces advanced on Shandrihalova north of Liman and liberated Dvorichna and Horobivka in the northern section of this front. On the following day, Russia lost Serednya. On the last day of the month, Ukraine completed its encirclement of Liman by breaking through the Russian defences in Stavki and cutting the access of the Russian army to the last line of supply to Liman from Toska. Only on that day, the Russian army finally decided to help their troops defending Liman. The remnants of the 201st Military Base were sent to defend a narrow corridor between Zaporozhye and Toska, allowing at least a portion of the defenders to leave. By the morning of October 1st, Liman, as well as Zaporozhye and Toska, were under Ukrainian control. It is difficult to say how many soldiers Russia lost here, dead or captured, but the retreat took place under intense Ukrainian fire, and videos of the Russian dead and their equipment emerged on the internet. An interesting wrinkle in the Ukrainian offensive in the Liman area was the earlier advance from Siversk to the east. They were able to retake Spyena and reach the edge of Verkhnokamianska, which put pressure on the Lysychansk-Severodonetsk agglomeration from the southwest. This forced the Russians to move elements of the 90th Tank Division and units of Wagner mercenaries to reinforce the area, which possibly didn't allow them to come to the aid of Liman, and surely alleviated some pressure on the Ukrainian defenders of Soledar and Bakhmut. Why was the Ukrainian attack so successful in the Liman area? It seems that Ukraine was able to overwhelm Russian defences with its mobile units, which quickly drove through the sparse enemy defences, creating danger in the rear. The point of attack changed multiple times, from Lysychansk to Liman to Kreminna to Svatova to Troitska. All of these areas are crucial for the Russian defences in the area, so instead of concentrating their limited reinforcements, Putin's commanders were forced to use them piecemeal in order to keep a semblance of a front. Russian soldiers and junior commanders complained, through the military bloggers, that their communication devices failed them. They resorted to using Chinese Baofeng handheld radios, which are unencrypted, and that allowed the Ukrainians to listen in and jam communications, even on the company level, making it impossible to properly communicate. Apparently, this situation is even worse among the Donetsk and Luhansk separatists, who were forced to use Soviet-era unencrypted devices. Simultaneously, the Russian Air Force failed to help the units being surrounded. A few attempts made to conduct CAS sorties on the 24th led to the destruction of up to 6 aircraft and 5 helicopters, and the Russians stopped trying to change the situation using their aircraft. Simultaneously, the majority of the troops defending Liman were the remnants of the units that were defeated in Kharkiv at the beginning of September, and they failed to create any sort of cohesion. It should also be noted that Ukraine used its HIMARS system to destroy a number of Russian command bases in the Alchevsk, Kadivka and Svatova areas in the early days of the offensive, and there are claims that some senior officers were killed in these attacks, which made the command situation more difficult. The rumors are also swirling that Putin now has direct command of the front, which is historically a very good idea if you want to lose the war, and it was his direct order not to retreat from Liman until the very end. The taking of Liman opens up a number of opportunities for Ukraine, and they will surely try to press their advantage before the beginning of the rainy season and the arrival of the Russian conscripts. Starobilsk is now in range of the Ukrainian missiles, which means that another supply line to Luhansk can be interdicted. Meanwhile, Russia will try to build another defensive line from Svatova to Lysychansk and hope that it will hold this time, unlike the one to the east of Oskil. Ukraine now has a foothold across the Zherebets River, and the high ground between the rivers Krasna will be hugely important for both sides in October. What happened on other fronts in the second half of September? Stalemate persisted in Zaporozhye, but information about the redeployment of troops on both sides to this front continued flowing. Could Zaporozhye become the next axis of the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Many Russian military bloggers certainly think so. It makes a lot of military sense to choose this direction for the Ukrainian army, as the liberation of the occupied portion of Zaporozhye Oblast, particularly its key supply lines going through Tokmak and Mariupol, would mean that the besieged Russian units in Kherson would have to rely on a single supply route connecting Russia to Crimea, the Kerch Bridge. This could certainly exacerbate the situation of the Russian army in Kherson Oblast, which is already suffering from poor supplies. Ukraine's Kherson campaign continued focusing on diminishing the Russian firepower and manpower on this front, as there were more reports of Ukrainian precision strikes on Russian pontoon bridges and barges on the river Dnipro than of actual advances on the ground. The most notable advances of the Ukrainian army were the liberation of Bilayivka in the northeastern section of the front on September 18th and of Bezemena on September 28th to expand the Andrivka-Lozovo bridgehead. While the direct advance on the city of Kherson via the M14 highway is the shortest route to the city, it also has the most formidable defensive fortifications erected by the Russian army on this front. Thus, we will probably continue seeing more updates from the Ukrainian bridgehead on the right bank of the Inhalets, where heavy battles around Snehirivka and Davydiv Brid have been reported throughout September, and from the northeastern section. But as Ukraine continues hitting the Russian pontoon bridges and barges over the river Dnipro, as it did on September 18th and 26th, Russia's military supplies in the area will continue diminishing. There is also a rumor that a number of units training around Odessa will soon join the Kherson offensive. On the Donbass front, the same story continued perplexing the military analysts. Wagner mercenaries, the DPR units, elements of the 144th Motor Rifle Division, and other groups continued their attempts to advance near Bakhmut, Soledar, Pisky, and in other directions, despite the Russian failure to stabilize its front on the eastern bank of Oskil. Here, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade managed to largely stand its ground, as the Russian advance on this front was minuscule. Russia has failed to make any meaningful gains in Donbass since July, and is sustaining heavy losses in areas that Ukraine has been fortifying since the start of the war in Donbass in 2014. It looks like the Russian command has chosen to continue its efforts to break through around Bakhmut, as they need some kind of a win on the battlefield to appease Russian society and the elite, which is becoming increasingly unhappy with the Russian war effort. The Russian advance in this area, that was part of a strategy to advance on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk in order to strengthen the Russian hold on Donbass, is now unlikely to produce any major strategic shift in the area, as recent Ukrainian victories have relieved Slavyansk and Kramatorsk from a threat coming from the north. At this point, it looks like we'll be seeing most of the action on the Donbass front around the Lysychansk and Severodonetsk section in October, where Ukraine has gained a foothold in Bilohorivka and Spina. Russian losses in September cause anger among Russian military bloggers, the influential pro-war portion of the elite, and confusion among the general Russian public. After all, for months, the Kremlin was telling the public that everything was going according to their plan in Ukraine. The Russian command has been trying to compensate for their shortage of manpower in Ukraine through crypto mobilization efforts, such as the recruitment of prisoners into Wagner units and the creation of local volunteer battalions. But the situation on the ground shows that this has not been enough. The Third Corps, which was supposed to turn the tide on the front, was seemingly divided and used to pad up the numbers of units who suffered massive casualties. For months, vocal military bloggers have been demanding general mobilization in Russia, but Putin and the Russian elite have been reluctant to do that due to the political risks involved. But terrible results in September forced the Kremlin to rethink its position. It is rumored that Putin became the chief proponent of mobilization in Russia, as he too has grown unhappy with the military situation. On September 20th, the Russian occupation administration of Kherson and Zaporozhye oblasts and the puppet regimes established in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts stated their intention to hold referenda in these areas on September 23rd to 27th, with an intention to merge with Russia. Simultaneously, the Russian State Duma adopted amendments related to mobilization and martial law. These moves were immediately condemned by Ukraine and the West. The NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, stated that the Russian actions were only going to worsen the situation, and called to provide more support to Ukraine. The US Department of Justice called Congress to legalize the transfer of Russian assets, worth over $300 billion frozen by the United States, to Ukraine. This did not stop Putin from ordering partial mobilization on September 21st, even though at the beginning of the war, namely on March 8th, he promised not to call up reservists, as according to his magnificent wisdom, all the goals of the so-called special military operation were being fulfilled by professional soldiers. He also threatened the world by saying that Russia will use all the instruments at its disposal to counter a threat against its territorial integrity. This is not a bluff, in a thinly veiled threat of using nuclear weapons. At this point, Russia's intention was to annex occupied regions of Ukraine. It is evident that Ukraine is not going to stop its plans to liberate them, actions that Russia is going to interpret as an attack on its territorial integrity. Putin's statement means that Russia will consider using nuclear weapons if Ukraine continues its deoccupation efforts. It seems like the goal of the threats was to force the West to decrease its support for Ukraine. But so far it looks like the West is not going to alter its course of supporting Ukraine. Particularly, the United States has reiterated its support for Ukraine and cautioned Russia against the use of nuclear weapons. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, warned Russia of horrific consequences and noted that it was privately conveyed to the Russian government that the United States was going to respond. So far, the United States has indicated that its response to a potential nuclear attack of Russia on Ukraine is going to be non-nuclear. Destruction of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Russian military bases and infrastructure in Ukraine, and even direct involvement of NATO armies in the war in Ukraine are considered some of the options that the United States and the West may use as a response. It is clear that major geopolitical players like China and India, which have been largely neutral regarding the war in Ukraine so far, are not too fond of nuclear threats posed by Putin. The good news is that the American and Ukrainian officials have stated on several occasions that they do not believe that the nuclear threat is imminent. On September 28th, US intelligence officials noted to CNN that they've not seen any indications that Russia is intending to use nuclear weapons at this point. While on September 30th, the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence, Kyrylo Budinov, claimed that there was no reason to believe that Russia plans to use nuclear weapons anytime soon. Nevertheless, the risk of use of a nuclear weapon is at its highest perhaps since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What about mobilization? What impact can it have on the war in Ukraine? The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, stated that around 300,000 Russians are going to be mobilized. These would be people who have already received military training while being conscripted soldiers. Several groups, like students and workers in the IT sector, would be exempted from mobilization. According to the Russian government, mobilized soldiers would be sent to the battlefield only after completing their training course. But almost immediately, the mobilization led to a mini-crisis. The Russian opposition media outlets claimed that the actual number of Russians to be mobilized would be 1.2 million instead of 300,000. Thousands of Russians protesting mobilization were brutally dispersed and arrested. Some of the arrested received mobilization summons. At least 200,000 Russians have fled the country to Georgia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and other neighboring countries. So far, the conduct of mobilization in Russia has been nothing short of shambolic. It is widely reported that people are indiscriminately summoned to conscription offices, voenkomats, as people with medical conditions making them incompatible with military service, people who have not been conscripted before, and senior citizens not fit for military service have been called up. Moreover, footage of very poor conditions of military bases hosting mobilized soldiers, rusted Kalashnikovs, and conscription officers calling mobilized soldiers to ask their families and friends to provide them with necessary military and medical supplies have been a clear demonstration that Russia is very poorly prepared for its first mobilization since the Second World War. It is rumored that local military conscription administrators have been ordered to fulfill their quotas of conscripted men, which has forced them to conduct indiscriminate mobilization. While Putin has publicly called upon the officers carrying out mobilization to refrain from excesses, so far the conduct of mobilization has continued to be poor. Some Russians are actively opposing mobilization, setting fire to and vandalizing voenkomats, as numerous incidents related to this have been reported. In one instance, a chief recruiting officer was killed. Ukraine has been confident in the face of Russian mobilization. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army, Valery Zaluzhny, was quoted to say, "We dealt with the professional Russian army, now it is time to defeat the unprofessional army." We cannot be entirely sure of the impact of the Russian mobilization on the war in Ukraine at this point. On one hand, Russia has been clearly suffering from the shortage of manpower in Ukraine, which has made the recent Ukrainian advance easier. Mobilization will definitely solve the manpower shortage, but on the other hand, the conduct of mobilization creates many questions about the combat readiness of new Russian conscripts. Ukrainians are reporting that some mobilized troops have already been deployed in Ukraine, and videos show that some of them have already surrendered. It means that at least some of the mobilized Russians do not undergo any kind of military training and are immediately sent to Ukraine with very minimal equipment. Moreover, some Russian military bloggers criticize the mobilization decision as poorly timed. They argue that the mobilization could have made a difference at the beginning of the war, when Russia was advancing and still possessed almost the entirety of its military arsenal. Russia has lost a lot of military equipment. It has depleted the supplies of its newest weapons, and Western supplies have allowed Ukraine to have an advantage in quality of military equipment, which has somewhat compensated for the disadvantage in quantity. Russia does not have as much firepower as it did at the beginning of the war, and as the West continues supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry, the mobilization of poorly trained and equipped Russian soldiers is not going to have as much of an impact as it could have had at the beginning of the war. Finally, mobilization is going to increase the political temperature in Russia, as support for the war is going to shrink with mounting losses. The polls conducted in Russia show that those who want the continuation of the war and those who want negotiations are now in parity. Particularly the situation in the national republics of the Russian Federation is worth monitoring, as some of the most violent protests took place there. Reports of disproportionate conscription of ethnic minorities are going to further deteriorate their confidence in the Russian government. It is notable that the head of the Chechen Republic and one of the most vocal supporters of the Russian invasion, Ramzan Kadyrov, has stated that mobilization is not going to be conducted in Chechnya, as the republic has already fulfilled its quota. Kadyrov and the owner of Wagner, Prigozhin, were also very vocal in the last days of September, calling for the dismissal of the MOD leadership. Such blatant insistences of insubordination are rare for Russia, and they show that the situation may get out of control. There are also rumors that Putin asked Lukashenko to start the mobilization of 120,000 Belarusian troops and supply a further 100,000 Russians in order to attack Ukraine from the north yet again. But there is little substance to these rumors, and it is highly unlikely that Belarus can field 120,000 troops and supply 100,000 Russians. The exchange of prisoners of war on the same day as the decision on mobilization is going to harm the confidence of the Russian public in its leadership too. Negotiations mediated by Turkey and Saudi Arabia have led to the release of 215 Ukrainian POWs, the bulk of whom were the leadership of the Azov regiment, as well as the international volunteers who were condemned to execution in Donbass, in exchange for 55 Russian POWs and the arrested pro-Russian politician and Putin's personal friend, Viktor Medvedchuk. The nationalist segment of Russian society has harshly criticized this decision, as the Azov battalion has been the key pillar of the Russian narrative of the neo-Nazi takeover of Ukraine. The Russian public expected heavy punishment for Azov fighters and foreign volunteers, not their release. On September 27th, sham referenda in the occupied oblasts of Ukraine, which were often conducted at the gunpoint of Russian soldiers, took place, and as predicted, the official results were obviously quote-unquote in favor of joining Russia. On September 30th, Putin conducted a ceremony where he stated his decision to annex the occupied territories into Russia. So far, Ukraine has not been deterred by this, as they have continued their liberation operations on territories annexed by Russia. Zelensky stated that Ukraine does not intend to hold any talks with Russia as long as Putin is its president. Moreover, Ukraine has officially applied for NATO membership. It is possible to deduce that the Ukrainian government would not make this decision without having some kind of behind-the-doors agreement with the United States. Several NATO member states have publicly supported Ukraine's membership, but the official response of NATO has been ambiguous. The September victories of the Ukrainian army is proof that Ukraine has finally gained strategic initiative on the battlefield. Ukraine's advance has forced Russia to conduct mobilization, annex occupied territories, and threaten the whole world with nuclear war. So far, the West has refused to back down in the face of its threats. The United States and Norway have pledged to provide NASAMS surface-to-air missile systems to Ukraine. Germany has provided 2 additional M270 multiple rocket launcher systems and 50 Dingo heavily armored infantry mobility vehicles. Moreover, on September 28th, the United States pledged to supply Ukraine with a military aid package worth $1.1 billion to be provided in a period between 6 months and 2 years, which includes 18 more HIMARS systems, more radar systems, more ammunition, and anti-drone systems. It has been reported that the anti-drone systems have already been delivered to Ukraine, as Iranian strike drones given to Russia have emerged as a new threat that Ukraine has to deal with. While Ukraine claims that its air defense system has mostly been able to deal with this threat, some drones occasionally slip through the cracks to cause harm. American anti-drone systems are going to help Ukraine in that respect. The unity of the Western Alliance is going to face its first major test in the upcoming winter amidst the major decrease in Russian gas supplies. On September 26th, further worrying reports emerged in the Baltic Sea, as the European governments were informed about damage to the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines. The damage has caused gas leaks and has made the pipelines practically unusable. Sabotage is the most likely cause of these damages, but unlike some news anchors, we're not going to rumourmonger. On the diplomatic front, the degree of tensions continued to rise. A Japanese diplomat was arrested in Russia and charged with spying. Armenia claimed that it has bought $600 million worth of Russian weapons, but none were delivered, possibly because of the failures in Ukraine. Calls for Armenia to leave the CSTO and build closer ties with the West were made in the country. Meanwhile, the Turkish government seemingly leaked that they attempted to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia on a number of occasions, but Putin rejected these overtures. The 7th month of the Russian invasion of Ukraine continued bringing more misery to the civilian population. Several instances of loss of dozens of lives in attacks on civilian areas have been reported in Dnipro, Zaporozhye, Donetsk and Kharkiv oblasts. The escalation of the war is unfortunately only going to make the situation worse. September has been the most successful month for Ukraine, as the Ukrainian army has liberated more than 10,000 square kilometers of land. Almost 2% of the country has been liberated, and Russia now controls around 18%. The situation on the battlefield is probably going to intensify in October, because soon the weather will turn much of the terrain into mud, making it difficult to advance. For now, Ukraine has momentum and will be looking to develop its success. There were no credible reports on manpower losses on either side. By October 2nd, the visually confirmed losses of the sides, according to the Oryx blog, are as follows. For Russia, they are 1,233 tanks, 2,556 vehicles, 162 command posts and communication stations, 21 heavy mortars, 380 artillery pieces and vehicles, 117 multiple rocket launchers, 59 aircraft, 51 helicopters, and 133 drones. On the Ukrainian side, the visually confirmed equipment losses are the following: 274 tanks, 687 vehicles, 7 command posts and communication stations, 121 artillery pieces and vehicles, 24 multiple rocket launchers, 48 aircraft, 14 helicopters, and 36 drones. Our coverage of the war will continue, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps us immensely. Our videos would be impossible to produce without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links down in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.